Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion for Working Group 6. My name is Shannon Carpenter. I am a professor of pediatrics and the director of the Kansas City Hemophilia Treatment Center. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of the steering committee and also to be part of Working Group 6. It was a very interesting and informative group, the subgroup that Dr. Ragney led. And also thank you for inviting me to be the moderator for this session. To start off, I'd like to, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll be able to follow that. Additionally, this session is being recorded. I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel for today. You've met many of them already. Ragney is the medical director of the Hemophilia Center of Western Pennsylvania. And has been involved in multiple clinical studies, and I think had a wonderful talk about different ways we can do studies. Dr. Jordan Shavit is a professor of pediatrics in the University of Michigan. He's gave our talk about workforce and led that subgroup. Dr. Guy Young is the director of the Hemostasis and Thrombosis Center at the Children's Hospital of LA and is also a pediatric hematologist as well. Dr. Charles Bailey is a pediatric hematologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and gave our plenary and is the informatics lead for PedsNet. Ziva Mann is the director of assessment and development of Ascent Leadership Networks and was our subject matter expert for this area. And then Crystal Watson is the president and chief executive officer of the American Thrombosis and Hemostasis Network. So please join me in welcoming our panel. And I'd like to dive into some of the questions that have been generated already. And so I'm just going to start with a couple of general questions that were for our panel. And I asked everyone to respond to these, but I'll pick on a couple of people specifically to start off with. So what do we know about the challenges that the current workforce has in regards to research? What questions need to be asked to better understand the situation? So I'll start with Jordan for this one, since it does have a workforce question, but I'll also let Maggie know I'll be coming to you as well. So please go ahead, Jordan.
So challenges to the current workforce is the question?
Yeah, yes. Specifically in how it relates to research, I think is the question.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a number of challenges. I mean, one of the ones that comes to my mind first is the challenge of access to state-of-the-art resources, right? So being able to access databases, knowing how to work with them, knowing how to run the statistical analyses on them, how to do the informatics, like we heard in the plenary, how to access that kind of expertise and do that. And so I think that's one of the main issues, and we need that to be able to go forward with research. There are some other things that come to mind. I don't want to talk too much, but another thing is training. Certain members in bringing in other members of the team, not just the ones we classically think about for research, right? The MDs and the PhDs, but the rest of the HTC team, which can be very involved in getting them the proper training to be able to engage in research. I mean, they do already, but to engage in at a higher level and maybe, design or lead some of their own projects.
Dr. Ragney, what are some of your thoughts in terms of that?
I very much agree with what Jordan just said. I think to do good research, we need to have a workforce that is enabled, supported, and trained to do that research, as well as becomes as aware as we have become about the critical importance of the community and the interaction with that community and involving them in the entire effort from beginning to end, to engage them, to talk with them, to hear what their needs are, to assure that what we're designing or what we're doing is meeting their needs and going to improve their health outcomes. So I think that gives a wrinkle that makes research harder, but in the end will make it much better. But it's not just us investigators, but it's the entire HTC staff. And it also underscores what I think is one of the most critical things is that the research must be integral part of the HTC network. Without question, that the model for care is the model for research. We're accomplishing important aspects of improving outcomes for patients.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think
Shannon,
that's
I'd like to add something.
Yeah, I was.
If
Yeah,
I may,
please.
just really briefly. I think that, you know, this is the practical nature in me, is it's really about identifying individuals. Let's be honest, not everybody's interested in hematology, and not everybody's interested in hematology is interested in research. The idea is to identify people fairly early on. When I say early on, I mean, you know, residency. I think medical students don't necessarily really know what they want to do. Some maybe, but, you know, people who are in residency thinking about hematology oncology, and then trying to engage them and say, you know, hematology oncology is not just oncology, because a lot of people think that it's all about kids with cancer. Not that that's not a terrible issue or terrible problem. So I think the idea is let's try to engage with late residents who are thinking about hematology oncology and early fellows, and try to identify people who really are interested in our field, and then engage them and nurture them so that they really do get interested in the research. And I think that's the key. I think if we just throw a blanket out there and say, hey, anybody's interested, yeah, let me know. But I think we have to really, within our own institutions, just find and identify those people who are interested, and then really nurture them, mentor them, so that by the time they're in fellowship, or as they get later in fellowship, they realize that, yeah, this is what they want to do. They want to do research in hematology. Thanks.
So I completely agree. I have a kind of a follow-up question to that, though. And Dr. Bailey, I was curious, are there specific trainings that we should be doing for our workforce? And I should mention for the group that Dr. Bailey has informed us that he does need to leave a little bit early. And so he's not angry and leaving the chat. But maybe, I don't know what we're going to say, but he does have to leave either way. So any specific training we should be focusing on?
So I actually would say that there are two things, right? The first is, you know, we talk a lot in sort of pop culture about a digital revolution and about the last 20 to 30 years having really been transformative in the way that we do things. I suspect that's probably true for most generations. They sort of look around and things are different. But one of the things that we manage in the academic enterprise is to be very conservative, right? You know, we're good at trying to preserve the skills and the knowledge and the experience of people who have been doing this for a while, and sort of without quite realizing it, what that means is we focus on the questions and the methods that we're used to employing, right? I'm giving myself away, but you know, when I started in graduate school, there was a lot of talk among the people who were sort of leading researchers that there was this funny thing called molecular biology, and it was a flash in the pan, and no one would ever really have a whole lot to do with it, you know, because we knew what biochemistry was like. So I think partly there is a new set of skills. Some of it has to do with engaging with data, right? I think most of us were trained, whether in med school or in grad school, on how to do sort of very tightly specified, lovingly crafted small experiments that investigate one hypothesis at a time. And we live in a world where there are just blizzards of information coming at you. And so there's a distinct skill set that helps you to engage with that information. The other thing that I would say is that one of the things we have, particularly since the sort of late aughts, really been much more deliberate about is the notion that research has at least two purposes, right? One purpose is to better understand the biology of really the human organism, but disease states as well, and to understand how health comes to happen at a biochemical and a cellular level. We're really good at that, right? The other part of research is to make people healthy, right? To help make sick people better and healthy people healthier. And I think we're just realizing that may change the way we have to ask some questions, that effectiveness is not the same thing as efficacy, right? Or that population management is not the same thing as a carefully recruited clinical trial cohort. And so there is a separate set of skills and competencies that go with that as well, with the process, not just of engaging people up and down the spectrum, from patient to clinician to organization, but also asking how do these questions actually change somebody's health, right? Because those are often questions that are harder to get your head around.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, and it offers me a wonderful segue to Ziva to ask her opinion on our workforce and kind of how we can engage the community and the patient voice in our training in a way that maybe can be imaginative and creative and start to think about some of these new ways of approaching people. Do you have a thought on that?
So I think when it comes to workforce, we have a couple of challenges. First of all, we want, if we're going to move in this direction, and I would dearly hope we are, and that we already have been, starting to use research as a tool to kind of help create health, right? To understand health, to understand the parameters of what works. And we understand social determinants of health, but let's take it a step farther with this narrower population, right, of people who have this one particular set of conditions. So now we're talking about research where you need to build trust. And the more diverse the workforce is, right, the more diverse our backgrounds, the more diverse the people who are going out and connecting with communities, especially communities of experiencing things like health inequity, right? The more important it is that the person who's talking to you looks like you, right? You have a shared background. They can speak to you in some safety, trust, which is a difficult word, trust, to use in a profession where people are giving their lives to serve the needs of others, right? But it makes it easier to understand where the shared grounds lies.
Yeah.
And make that connection of the relationships. Beyond that, I know that there are trainings, there are like medical schools that bring in patients who have particular conditions and say, tell your story. The challenge is that, it's really lovely to be asked to tell your story. But then what happens? And I think we do much better by finding ways to integrate people and families who are living with inherited blood disorders into our conversations about, hey, we have this particular process in our clinic. Can we talk to you about whether or not it works and how we could tweak it so it could work better? Because then you get our perspective and we feel like we have a value beyond that of getting up and just sort of spilling our guts on this, on stage for a story. So I would say,
just as a bit of an aside, one of my greatest tools is to take residents and fellows to camp, because I tell them they're getting to see the kids in their natural habitat. Because, that's the opportunity to really see someone really living and not just showing up, as Merelda was saying earlier, come to where we are. And I think that is a very powerful statement and really spoke to me. Crystal, I know that representing HCRS in Athens, we have both of us, mentored and training groups, training processes for people, but I think a lot of times they come to us, asking for those things. How do you see us, Athens and other groups being able to reach out to kind of build this process?
I think it's a really important question, and one that we've been thinking about a lot over the past year. Shannon, with HCRS and Athens, we certainly have the DREAM Award, which is the Mentored Physician Award. We also do a CARE Award, which is for non-physicians to do research. But I think it really has to start at the ground level. And that's one of the reasons why we've been working on the Athens Data Management Community of Practice, because the people in the clinic who are doing the work, and also the data managers themselves who may not be clinicians, have to really buy in to what is happening within the community and within the clinic itself. And I think providing opportunities for everyone to participate is a way to really grow the research and the community at large.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point. And I think there's I always just want to try to think of a new way to do things, right? Because we have these great programs, but maybe there's something we're missing. Maybe there's an option that we haven't thought of yet. So we'll keep asking that question, I think. So I want to turn to Dr. Bailey. There are a couple of specific questions for you about your talk, which are excellent, from Dr. D. McKelly. So the PedsNet database, including the data architecture, operational structure, and data dictionary, could prove useful to the bleeding disorders community and may already be in use by some of its investigators. How could PedsNet be better accessed and further adapted to the needs of this community?
I think that's a great question. And I think the root of my answer is we're learning along with everybody else, right? What PedsNet tries to do is create three things: scale, right? We try to be able to let people address a big enough community that we can find things that are uncommon. Trust, right? We want to be able to have the work that we do be a bidirectional conversation, right? And what I'll call effectiveness, right? The root of what we do is in the process of taking care of and learning from patients and their families. So in all of those areas, I think we have opportunities to learn from the bleeding disorders community, right? And we have opportunities to engage with them. If we look at some of the things that have worked in PedsNet in the past, I think we can draw some examples, right? So scale has been very helpful to investigators who have been looking at rare diseases and rare outcomes in rare diseases. And that's one of the places that we see ourselves as being able to offer an opportunity, right? That in the community, the term that we apply to ourselves is public utility, right? The goal here is not to do our research, it's to do the research of the people who need to answer questions. And so we try to make establishing collaboration easy. We try to make doing research easy, right? That's a very kind of investigator-focused perspective. We have also found that PedsNet is a great opportunity to do quality measurement in the non-punitive sense of quality measurement. It's an ability to look at how we do things differently in different places and where that works. Sometimes we kind of know what's going to work and we can get evidence for that. Sometimes we just know we do it differently and are not sure what's better. And now we have the opportunity to look and see over time, over people, what actually works better. And so it's an incubator for testing good ideas. I think one of the things we aspire to that is maybe particularly useful to folks in the bleeding disorders community who have conditions that require more medical care is how do we engage in what we call the efferent arm of what we do? How do we engage in changing practice or in making practice better? Right now, we're in a place where we can learn a lot. But one of the things as health systems and as clinicians we have historically not done a fantastic job of is taking what we learn and putting it into practice rapidly, right? And so part of what we'd like to be able to do is engage the community more, both in terms of telling us what's important, right? A lot of our focus now is on health systems. We have the opportunity to engage in dialogue with health communities, right? And to become more involved in the practice of delivering care. If you look at networks that do that really well, they're generally smaller scale, but we can learn a lot from them. And they will do things like try to engage with clinicians and patients before illness becomes symptomatic or before patients come for visits and see how can we possibly optimize what we're doing, or what are our chances to learn from somebody else who's had a disease course similar to yours, right? So I think we have a lot of growing to do. Much of that growing has to do with capacity, but much of it also has to do with trust, right? That networks like PedsNet are based fundamentally on the notion that when we as clinicians interact with patients and families, there's a trust relationship there, and part of that is that the patients and the families trust that we will use the information that they share with us to get better at what we do, right? That it's not enough to just say, okay, I know some more now. And so we want to be able to expand that outside the clinic.
You know, Shannon, I just want to ask a question. So I admire the operational aspects of PedsNet and how this works and how you have gotten everybody to play in the same sandbox and to feel that they're part and parcel of making decisions and are willing to work together to a common goal. And I think that's something we could really capitalize on. I think we really do need to have partnerships. We need within our HTC network, investigators who work together on steering committees to design protocols. I mean, the precedent is clearly there, not just in your organization, but in the AIDS clinical trials group, which we had a chance to work with many years ago, even in how COVID trials were done. I mean, I think it's absolutely incredible that these guys got together, work together, because this was such an incredible problem that it needed rapid answers. It needed coordination and agreement and playing in the same sandbox, which I think is one of the big things we're lacking and we need. So I'm very interested in the models you use to achieve that. We're aware that that's happening in I-SPY, which is the breast cancer consortium, in the ovarian cancer consortiums, glioblastoma. They work together, multiple trials, very efficient. That is something that we need to do. And I would love to hear more about how you got that to happen. And maybe that's not the forum of this discussion, but I think we have a lot to learn. And I do have one question. Were patients and families part of the steering committee planning protocol group as it happened? It was in the AIDS clinical trials group. We couldn't go to one meeting without those guys at our table who were telling us we weren't working fast enough. And they were right. Wait, I'm sorry. I'd be very interested.
I agree with the principle. And in PedsNet's case, yes, they were, right? You know, in PedsNet's case, because we grew out of advocacy networks, and we sort of grew out of PCORI, which has a very strong focus on meaningful to patients. We've actually had the privilege of having these conversations from the very start with patients, with health systems, with clinicians at the table, right? And some of that has to do with diversity of perspective. Some of that has to do with us unlearning things. Excuse me. There's no better way I know to get people kind of jolted out of their academic rut than to have somebody saying, this is not about you. This is not about your grant. And also, by the way, it's not about risk, right? Some of the places where the family voices have been loudest is when we talk about building trust and institutions start to say, well, we can't really share data. That's going to be a risk to patients. The patients are the ones standing up and saying, wait a minute. I am intensely interested in moving forward what we know about the condition that affects me or my child. And if what you're telling me is that your risk office is saying you can't do studies that are going to advance knowledge, please rethink that, right? So those voices are very important up and down the line. It does, to kind of carry back to some of the discussion we were having before the session started, mean that we have to unlearn some of the language and some of the process that we're used to, right? We get very good at big words. We get very good at complicated protocols, that sort of stuff. And it's a great opportunity to reevaluate how much of that is necessary and how much of that is just the way we proceed. And as we learn new and more effective ways to do things, can be sort of set aside.
I love how you guys just kept trooping on as I got kicked out of the Zoom twice. That was awesome.
Well,
up?
sorry, but could I
Thank
ask?
you. No, I appreciate it. I should have. This crew I was not worried about. I was like, they'll keep talking. So
I ask one question, just one question,
Sure.
because I think we need to ask about PCORI and what Ziva and her group taught us that's so critical to this whole process. And so I hope you don't mind, but she was in our working group, and I'll be quiet.
No, that's awesome, Maggie. Yeah, it's great. Ziva?
Maggie, do you have a specific question?
Well, it's very
PCORI.
hard. Oh,
Out
yeah,
PCORI.
no, but it's very hard as the PCORI folks who talked with us showed us and explained to us that it's very hard for folks who have diseases to just sit down and be part of a group that's deciding some of these other things. It takes longer, it takes more work with them. So help us understand, if we were really to do this honestly, what would it take?
Well, okay. So I'm going to pick apart your question a little bit, Maggie, because there's a couple of different pieces. And one of them is like, kind of, what would it look like? And the other one would be kind of like, what would it take to make it work, right? So let's start with what would it look like. So one of the things that we proposed in this hub and spoke research model was this, to have a central group, right, that could provide different kinds of support depending on the way which model we end up with, which version of the model we end up with. And in all of those different versions, we wanted to integrate people and families who are living with inherited bleeding disorders. The thing that we talked to a PCORI about was actually, what does it look like in an individual study? Now, Maggie talked about her experience working with the AIDS group, right? It's great groups. And so Maggie, you have your experience. I actually happen to been part of supporting some community members who joined a PCORI research grant. And we actually reached out to PCORI and some of their evaluators to ask this, to sort of help us understand what it would look like in an individual research study level. And which is, for those of you who are not familiar with PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, I hope I got that right. But they have funded, and for our purposes, that's helpful, evaluated how people have engaged patients in thousands of trials now. I'm probably underestimating the number. And one of the things that they confirm for us is essentially, if you look at a given study, at every step of the way, there is an effective, impactful role that people and families, in our case, living with inherited blood disorders, can play. So let's take some examples, right? So you could identify priorities, research priorities, which is exactly what NHF has enabled us to do here, right? You can engage people in refining the research question you want to ask, engage them in study design to think about, like, how do we make this a study that people are able to participate in, right? So it's accessible, it's not asking too much, and people, you can actually have retention all the way through. You know, you can engage them in analysis. And so, I mean, I would refer you to PCORI for tons and tons of examples about how people have had impacts. There's all these tools out there. The important thing I would say is twofold. First of all, not only can you engage people at every step of the way, but they have this lovely little step ladder framework that they use to describe what that engagement could look like, right? You can ask for input. You could have a focus group. You could have an advisory, committee made of people and families that are, continually consulting. You can embed people in a multidisciplinary research team, right? Or you could have a co-PI, be a patient or a family member with a bleeding disorder. So, and what spot on the ladder you choose really depends on, well, really your capacity, right? How much resources you have. Do you have experience for with this sort of thing, or do you have somebody in your team who does have that experience? Because the higher up the level you go, the more it takes. And so Maggie was referencing, there was a lovely fellow, Ben LeCook, who is now the director of the Health Equity Research Lab at Harvard. His very first time engaging people and families who are living with a particular condition He went all the way in, all the way up to the collaboration level. So he had this multi-stakeholder group, and that required clarity about timelines, clarity about roles, that required sort of like somebody to answer questions. I was one of the support folks who was helping answer questions and sort of like work with the community members along the way, and it meant they had to go slow to go fast. Really, that's how it went. The important thing I would say is twofold. First of all, we learned that you do not need to have X number of degrees to join a multi-stakeholder committee as a patient or a community member. One of the people I was supporting is this extraordinary woman, an immigrant who never finished college, and she helped refine the research question. She helped them with their recruitment approach. She helped them with the analysis. I mean, she was giving valuable input every step of the way. Two, yeah, the first time out of the box, it takes work. And maybe Ben bit off a little more than he could chew. But the way he and his lead researcher described it to me was that it was a game changer. It was just transformed the way they think about how you should do research on things like health equity with people and families who are experiencing the problem that they're trying to better understand. And I will say, the community members who were part of that team said to me afterwards that it was the most meaningful thing they'd ever done. And that was before they realized that their names were listed as authors on the paper. So, what does it look like? It looks like a range of things. I think the important thing is that there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of options out there, and you need to make your best choices as researchers by thinking about what you're ready for. Just be prepared, you're gonna but that's what happens when you work things out. It should be rewarding.
I think this is great. I do think we have to think. Thank you, Ziva. I think that particular topic we did talk for an hour about it at our subgroup meeting, and we could I think continue to have that conversation. I think it really kind of segues into one of the questions that was put in the Q&A though, that has troubled me quite a bit, and I'd like to hear all the panelists respond to this. Is how do we, the question is, do you believe in regards to research, it is better to start smaller scale research projects focusing on one or two defined parameters in a total when you have discovered new data in a previously studied subject? Or should there be like a unified research project that incorporates a large amount of variables to be researched? So that's the question as put into the Q&A. And I had a little bit of a caveat, or my question that kind of builds off of it is, how do we, as the bleeding disorders community, ensure that we are including as many of the research priorities as we can without diluting the scientific validity of it, knowing that we have a diverse population, and then trying to include that diversity, not just in identity, but also in all the other intersectionality with diagnoses and such. How do we do that with the resources that we have? So for me, much of what we've discussed in the last few days has been the whys and the whats. And in the end, there's always the how. And I think that how is what this group has really been focused on. So I'm going to start with Guy on this one. I'm curious because I don't have the answer, and I'm hoping maybe you do. And you're muted.
Yeah, I definitely have the answer for sure, no doubt. No, seriously, I think we want to be careful, not to sort of pigeonhole things and say, well, only this is the kind of research that we should do in our community, because I think there's a lot of creative minds. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think however we go about answering the unanswered questions is fine. Obviously, the funding, the infrastructure, the workforce, we've talked about that. You need all of those in place to even be able to move forward. But if there's a narrow question that takes 6 months to a year to answer, something fairly simple and straightforward, and it's just going to really answer that narrow question, I think that's okay. I think if there's a sort of, Maggie was alluding to platform trials, so a study that's got lots of questions where patients get enrolled and get followed and a lot of data gets collected. And then from that, you can use that data, as Dr. Bailey has pointed out, to, you know, use large amounts of data or metadata to answer certain questions. That's fine too. I don't think we should say only one kind of research is the right kind of research. And so I think the idea behind my group, and I'll pivot it to answer that part, or to answer your question from that part, is I would like to see that every HTC can do at least a small piece of the research, because if we're all doing at least a small piece, that's just going to answer more and more questions, and that'll be better for patients in the long run. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Jordan, what are your thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, I'd have to agree that, right, there's no one right way to do anything, right? Small trials are important, big trials are important. I mean, one of the thoughts on that is, you know, it depends on your power, right? What kind of power do you have to answer that question, and what kind of resources do you have to do it? And I think that's a decision you have to make when you're deciding between that. If you have a lot of questions, a lot of variables you want to research, but you have a very small sample size, it's probably not a good idea to do that. And if you have a lot of great ideas in a big, cohort, but you don't have the resources to do it, or the resources, financially, or to do it right, to implement it and design it right, then you shouldn't do it either. I think maybe Shannon is, are you frozen?
Sorry, Maggie.
Yeah.
Sure. I remember Roger Lewis saying from Berry Consultants saying in one of our meetings, most of the data that's collected is useless. So it's not that we need to collect a lot of data, but we have so many compelling questions. Look at inhibitors. What a problem. And we'll never have enough patients to do a standard randomized trial yet. If we can set up a research network within our HTC care model, and everyone from birth and onward enrolls in a registry, we will have at least collected data, if we have common data collection, that could serve as control for some of those trials. We could launch observational studies at the same time right from that registry. You have a symptom, you have a risk factor, you can hop onto a trial, you can try a novel drug for a problem you have, you can prevent inhibitors. I don't think we want to limit it to one question. We have many questions. There are many compelling issues. We need to have partnerships that will ensure that we have the resources we need to do this and to do it now. And I think we can do that. We've looked at what those partnerships are. We need to have NHF, the foundation, that will help us with business models that will help us fund the training, fund the research, and we need our partners, the government and foundations and insurers and pharma, to help pay for what we should be in charge of. We should be in the driver's seat. We should be saying what we need and engage everyone, because the way that we will learn to do it with our experts in trial design is to do it efficiently. We already heard from our working group, it costs too much. It takes too long. It is just totally inefficient. We need to adopt efficiency and low cost trials. We need to set up all of these things, and there's no reason we can't. I think we need resources, we need experts, and I think we put together some of this in our group to say we need to do these things. And I think we need some cash to do it with. I think we need some inspiration. We need some sweat. and we need some go, go, go to get it done. And we need our community saying to us, you've got to do this now. Sorry.
Okay. Well, no, that's awesome. I love your passion. So Crystal, that is too good of a transition for you to not hand it over to you.
Thank you, Shannon. I mean, one of our major focuses over the past 2 years has been the evolution of our research model, because all of the things that Maggie said, you know, it costs too much. And then before that, the point that a lot of the small centers don't have an opportunity to participate. You know, Athens has had a lot of standalone research projects that have 25, 30 sites that were involved. A lot of the time it's the same 25 or 30 sites. So one of the main things that we've done over the past year has really evolved the way we think about how we're going to do research in the future, to look at more of a platform trial, so that we can have multiple study interventions, but only have to have rolled out the protocol and gone through the central IRB, done a lot of the upfront work once. So that's what Athens transcends. The new protocol that we have, it consists of multiple cohorts and arms, and it's really designed to allow interventions to enter and leave the protocol. And that can be based on, the observational piece is not based on decision algorithm as much as the interventional protocol that we're going to be building out certainly will. And those may be decision algorithms that are enhanced with machine learning. But for now, we have, a new protocol that's going to allow us to bring interventions in and out without having to stand up a whole new protocol that takes a lot of administrative, upkeep and in the beginning, but also they can be leveraged by a large number of sites so that the small sites have an opportunity to participate. And that happened recently. We have a small site, I'm in Georgia. We have a very small site in Georgia, which has never been part of our research before, and they just, signed on and they're going to be part of Transcends. So I'm really excited that we can start to support a larger number of sites in their, desire to do research.
Charles, I'm going to ask, thank you, Crystal. I'm going to ask this question a little bit differently to you, and then there's a follow-up question that was specific. So, when you have a structure like PedsNet, can you do both? Can you answer smaller scale research questions and larger scale? Is that, does that something that you feel is flexible enough within that kind of program?
So I think you have to, right? You're not, I love that people are talking about efficiency, right? Because you're not making use of the opportunities you have if you're not answering questions in a variety of different ways, right? And I think partly efficiency has to do with things like networks. Our goal is to make it so easy to answer an observational question that you would ask, why wouldn't you, right? But our goal is also to make it possible to say, look, we can only address this through a multi-site, multi-arm interventional study. I think when I talk about efficiency, there are two things in particular that I think about. The first is maybe a little bit of a voice from the loyal opposition about the utility of data, in the sense that I think we all learn how to be profligate in our science, how to do things that are very expensive and not very repeatable in the service of getting that last asymptotic tiny bit of control of bias or control of confounding, things like that. And we're really good at being afraid of things that are not done that way. Whereas we've seen again and again that networks like PedsNet and other networks can rapidly and inexpensively replicate the findings of clinical trials, right? So, there are methodologic approaches, there are approaches based on scale. And so part of efficiency is asking, what do you have and how do you make the best use of it, rather than starting from the preposition that what you have is not useful and you need to build it all anew, because that's the only way that's going to be controlled enough or pure enough to do the science. I think the other important consideration is, what question are you trying to answer, right? So there are some cases where you want to know the answer to a causality question, or you want to know the answer to a mechanism question, and it can be small, and you can find it, you can find your answer with a small group or a small trial, right? There are cases where you're going to want to know, how do you take better care of patients? Patients are never small. Patients are never uncomplicated. And so if you're going to get an answer that is actually going to help you to change how you take care of patients, particularly at scale, you have to ask a lot of questions. And trying to ask each of those questions in isolation so you get the perfect answer to the isolated question not only is inefficient, but it gives you the wrong answer too often. Right? And so part of what you need to be able to do is pull them all together and ask these sort of big, messy things. I don't think that's about how big your site is or how big your network is. It's about how big your mind is and how much you're willing to be able to engage with that messiness in order to get to an answer that's going to work in that messiness.
Right.
You know what, just
And
one
to follow up,
thing.
to follow up in that question, where can, so this is another question from Dr. DiMichele earlier. What are the current models for informatics training for health professionals where we can get that education, and where are current centers of excellence that training can be obtained?
Informatics is a new field, so we're kind of trying to look back and forward at the same time. For people who are early in their sort of arc of research or learning and coming up through a training system, there are some sort of more formal opportunities. There are master's programs like you would study epidemiology. You can study informatics or data science. There are groups that you can work in, just like you might do a postdoc somewhere. There's a board certification in clinical informatics that has a formal training curriculum that goes with it, and a fellowship. So if you're really committed to the field, you can get formal training. And there are ways to support that. ARC, for instance, has a large K-12 program that looks at teaching people how to do informatics-based and learning health systems research. So those are for people who are at that sort of happy point that they're moving into the field and say, okay, this is where I want to start. A lot of us are kind of well down the road, and we're asking ourselves, how do we pick that up? Honestly, I think there's no better way to do that than collaboration. One of the things that is key to the world of informatics is it's really hard to go off in a corner and do your own thing, but it also means we're a fairly collaborative bunch of people. And so, one of the fastest ways to bootstrap into the field, if you want to do the research, is collaborate with people who do this kind of stuff. And you will be far better at bleeding disorders than I am, but I may be able to add something about how to deal with messy data or large scale data, those kinds of things. There are plenty of opportunities to pick up methods or techniques. We're technology geeks, so there's lots of online education, but those are usually the kind of things that help you to answer a question or say, okay, I understand how to have a conversation. If you really want to engage in the research, there's nothing like sitting down with somebody and doing it.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I do think one of the beauties of rare disorder care and being a specialist in this area is, in pediatrics is, a rare disorder too, is that we all have to work together. And the collaborations and the collegiality is what drew me to the field, with the other professionals and then also with the patients.
I think that's part of why PCORI succeeds, right? It's made up of a bunch of pediatricians and we're used to working with each other.
Yeah. I have a few more questions, some good, really, really good pointed ones. So I'm gonna try to get to some of them. Both working group subgroups proposed HTC-based models for research that appeared somewhat different. And so how do we reconcile those? Or are these just all kind of, the tiered versus the network research model? Or are these just suggestions? These are ways we could do. And then we now our next job is to sit down and kind of talk about that a little bit more in depth. And I wonder, Dr. Young had to step away to see a patient. We can start with that. Or because I think, do you want to start with that, Maggie, and see what you think about that, and then how we do these structures? Or do you think that these are primarily just recommendations and working in a starting point for work? Or
Well, I guess the infrastructure that we were looking at was twofold. Was within the HTC network to start everyone from birth on a registry, and with symptoms and problems, they might be able to go on to different trials. But the other piece of this is how the hub and spoke network of HTCs should be able to incorporate research. And the model that we take it from really is the ACTG playbook, which when our patients developed AIDS, we did not form a brand new network. We worked with the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, and there were 10 regional centers, HTCs, that were able to offer clinical trials to their regions, and had the infrastructure at those sites to resource data managers, nurse coordinators, and the investigators. We went to meetings, we planned trials. We worked with the AIDS experts. We worked with the ACTG statistical experts. And so in that model, we were using a hub spoke, HTC network that relied on an organization outside of our network. So it's one of those more hybrid, where the ACTG was supplying a lot of the approach to the infrastructure, as well as had the contracts with pharma to do the trials, but they were calling the shots, and the community was in every one of our investigator meetings and in our subgroups where we design trials. And all I'm saying is that I think that the models are there. I also think.
And then do you think, I'm sorry, Maggie, do you think we have to do just one model? I mean,
No,
couldn't
no,
we, for
well,
different studies, do different models? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the other things I was just going to talk about was how wonderful the decentralized trial ideas are, which is not everyone is going to do a clinical trial in their center, or maybe even come into the center, but would be very interested in a telemed, monitored at home, less selective, more compatible with the patient kind of study, where you can still learn things, drugs delivered to the home. And really, that model can easily be presumably done at any site. The model there is the COVID playbook. So in other words, we can design it any way we want. And I suspect that we can do multiple types of studies, trials, observational studies. And the questions should drive what we want to do, as if we have the resources.
So yeah, that leads me to two questions. I don't want to forget this one because it was put in a bit ago. Bob Robinson puts in that some of this is a disconnect for him. The teams in the HTC are often really connected with the community, often from birth. And so why the issue is the people who aren't in the HT system, and why they are not in the HT system. And so that's not, it's just what is going on with the patients who, how do we engage those patients who aren't in the system? And the decentralized trials, I think, was something that occurred to me as being a good thing. But Jordan, we're in the great Midwest, and there's long distances between our patients and us. How do we engage those who aren't in the HTC, or who are maybe not getting into studies because they're far flung?
Right, and that's what I was thinking of at first when I read that question of the distance issue, and why many people may not be involved with the HTC. I think, though, that there's some of that going on even in large metropolitan areas where there are HTCs. I've heard. I don't know the scope of that and the numbers on it, but at least for the distance ones, one of the concerns is workforce. And we, one of the members of our committee, Amber Federizio in Las Vegas, has been trying to get a physician to come out and help with practice in that area, and it has had a very difficult time. And so, one of the questions is, why is that? Well, I think, it has to do with the same issues that rural America deals with and trying to get physicians in general, right? And this is a super subspecialist. And then also making it easier for other members of the workforce to get involved to practice, whether it be nurse practitioners in addition or physician's assistants, to be able to cover these gaps. I mean, that's something I think we have to look at for healthcare in general. And that segues to another topic, but maybe we can come, I saw Donna's question. I don't know if you want to go to that now or come back to that later.
Well, Donna's question actually falls on one that I was thinking about as well. And I'll take hers and make it, broaden it a little bit, is that, we're talking about some really big, expensive stuff here. And how do we pay for this? What are our resources? I mean, this is what keeps me up at night. I mean, how do we actually fund any of this? All these wonderful ideas over the last 3 days, and all this really vital research, who and how do we pay for it?
Right, so I'll talk about, workforce first along that, right? Since we're segueing from that last question. From a workforce perspective, we talked about this a lot. And there's many different ways to fund the workforce. And the first one we thought of is 340B funds. So some centers have been able to make really great use of 340B funds in the way that they're intended, to put that back into the community, right? To either train new care providers, bring in, new care providers to fund that. But other centers have not been able to do that for a variety of reasons. And we talked about those. I don't want to go into those details here. But so we thought it would be nice if we could have more standardization of that, have the centers who have been really good at that teach the other ones or help them to make that happen. So that's one thing. And then leveraging other existing resources, which I think are sometimes untapped. The NIH, the government sources, like, well, 340B is as well, but NIH, Department of Defense, grant programs, maybe more so NIH, training programs, to bring people into the field, to train more people, but not just that, to also train the mentors. There's actually an NIH grant that funds mentors to teach, gives them protected time so that they can teach. And then, of course, there's our traditional mechanisms, philanthropy and pharma. And I think we've only scratched the surface of what that can do. I think we can go out there and harvest, so to speak, more of that. I don't want to name any particular pharmaceuticals, but we know that there have been several who have really helped to train fellowships, fund fellowships for many years, that many of us on this panel, well, at least I think myself, and I think you, Shannon, have benefited from. And so there was that. And then I guess I'll stop there. Donna was also asking about pathways, but I think we'll stay in funding for now. Probably right, if you want to talk to Maggie about that.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
Shannon,
go
before we
ahead.
go there, can I just loop back to the question that was asked about reaching people outside of HTCs?
Oh, you're muted, Shannon.
I'm sorry, your hand blended in with your background, so I did not see it. My apologies.
No, totally fine. So I think really what that comes down to is, like, if we have an HTC hub and spoke network, and I'm not going to make any suppositions right now about whether or not that's an exclusive network or not, okay? HTC hub and spoke network, really reaching people outside of HTCs comes down to a question of who owns research, right? If the research belongs to the researchers, it belongs to the clinics, then you are only reaching the people who walk through the doors and who say yes. But if research belongs to let's say a group of diverse stakeholders, okay, and here I mean like people coming at it from different angles, including, say, your federal funders, and members of the community, now you're actually able to reach people in the community and make that research accessible. Otherwise, you're only going to get the folks inside the brick walls. And I think that does not solve the problem. I mean, Bob is actually pointing out that there's estimates of up to 35% of the population not going to HTCs. I would love to see more about that, but I think it is a genuine challenge. And it's something that having those partnerships could resolve.
a good point. Thank you for bringing up. Absolutely. And Bob is cheering for you now. So Maggie, did you want to comment on the funding question?
Yeah, so we did talk quite a bit about funding and how critical the partnerships were. I think Jordan has already talked about a number of these. I think one of the really critical things is that in order to sustain research, we must have these partnerships. And we should be in the driver's seat and make such a compelling argument for the research that's needed that people want to be part of that effort, that pharma would love to have us run their phase 4 post-licensure trials, and we can give them early looks at data, but we should be in the driver's seat for that trial. We want to engage all of our investigators, and we have to assure that all of them can play huge roles as PIs, as writing arms, writing trials, mentoring, training, having all of the academic accolades they need, but doing it within this network so that they will be engaged and will do it, because we're going to need them to do that. We need to promote how critical registries are and trial funding. And I think we need to show that the efficiency that we can set up, the cost savings if we work together, and the incredible rapidity of getting results and getting and leaving out the failing arms of trials and moving forward with new drugs and platform trials where that's possible. I think if you can make that compelling argument, if it's more efficient, it's better cost, we should be doing it. And our funding partners should be engaged to do it with us. And I will leave that to our business experts. I am not a businesswoman, but it seems to me this has been very effective in many other large platform trials, large organizations, where if you show them how it can be done efficiently and at cost savings, they will come.
So Charles, do you know of a pot of money that we haven't talked about yet that you'd like to let us know about?
So I wish money grew on trees. I don't think we've missed out on sort of dedicated funds. I do like that people are talking outside the federal funders. I think what I would say is we may be missing out on a pot of work that we don't think about, right? So Maggie, you're talking about a registry, for instance, right? I see patients in clinic. We talk about how things are going. I gather information about symptoms. I do laboratory tests. Those patients are in a registry, right?
Yeah,
and if they're willing to participate, then we don't need to do it again. Right? We don't need to say we're going to ignore everything we did taking care of those patients, and we're going to create a registry that will capture that data and do those tests all over again. So, and I'm not saying that that's what specifically we were proposed. I don't think we were at that level of granularity. But in addition to looking for more ways to fund it, I think we need to look for ways to change how we do it so that we can take advantage of what we're already doing and make the best use of that.
So speaking of that, we did talk about that for workforce, of trying to find new ways to do things. And actually, I just want to note, Bob Robinson has mentioned research foundations, creating foundations, and that was something I neglected to mention that we talked about as well, tapping foundations and societies. But when it comes to pathways to training, there's a lot of different ways that we can do it from the traditional routes, and it's been done a little bit over the years. And I think we can, leverage it and make it more. So, for example, small mentoring meetings. I've participated in those where we have maybe 30 people, and you have some mentors, and you, work through that. It's a great way to meet people personally, individually, and to do that. A number of societies have had that as a regular basis. Training, you go in with a a grant proposal that you've written, and then you get training from people to do that. So, a lot of thinking outside the box. Oh, we talked about things like mini fellowships or mini sabbaticals, where you take somebody with expertise and you bring them to your institution to train you in something, or you go to their institution to learn. An example of that is Aneta von Dragalski doing that with ultrasound, right? And that's been something that a lot of people have taken an advantage of. And then, the other thing, as I mentioned briefly, there's an NIH grant for it, but other grants or RFAs to target mentoring and training, right? We have a lot of grants for the trainees, but maybe we also need some grants for mentors to bring them in and to give them protected time to do that. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention is that we need to not just target the traditional roles. And I said this before, not just the physicians and PhDs, which most of these grants are those are the only folks eligible for those grants, for many of these mentored grants that we have. But consider other people who want to do this research and learn. People like nurse practitioners and physician's assistants, and then I could see social workers, physical therapists, all the members of the HTC being interested in that.
So I see that, yeah, thank you, Jordan. I see Crystal's hand is up, and Bob is also saying we should create a research foundation that feels that families would donate, and private families would support research. And I think that has been a successful model for other rare disorders. So I think that's a fantastic idea. Okay, Crystal, please.
Yes, Shannon, thanks. So I think, one thing that's really important, and several people alluded to it, is from an infrastructure and a financial standpoint, we need to make sure that we're leveraging what we have, because it's going to be impossible to really build huge networks of infrastructure, given the, especially with COVID and the constraint that we see in funding across the board from contributors in all sectors. So one really important thing is going to be to focus on leveraging what we build. And Charlie, Dr. Bailey certainly has a lot of capacity. Athens has spent 15 years and many millions of dollars building the infrastructure that we have that can be deployed to help support some of the things that we're talking about here today. I mean, Maggie, your slide, looking at the components that you need, for instance, we need a central IRB. We need e-consenting in place. So Athens, we have those things. We need to be able to collect data nationally. That's something that we've been pretty successful at. The other thing that you mentioned is biorepository. You may or may not know that Athens has a research biorepository at the University of Wisconsin, and with Dr. Lynn Malik as the PI. So, those assets are available for the network to work collaboratively and partner to do some of the research. One of the ways that we've been able to even expand and use the infrastructure more recently is that we are leveraging the infrastructure to support Dr. Diane Nugent and Mary Brown from the Sickle Cell Disease Foundation with their project of Networking California for sickle cell care. And they're going to be using Athens systems for clinical data collection. We're doing EMR integration. We're also doing health information exchange integration, so that we're bringing data in from multiple sickle cell clinics and HIEs in California into a sickle cell data warehouse, so that we can provide access to that data for research, but also access directly to patients. So there's a planned patient portal out of that data warehouse, so that patients can potentially just, whether it's through a mobile app or a desktop, go in and access some of that data. So, we're thinking about ways that we can leverage what we've built, not only to support, hemophilia, but also other networks such as sickle cell, which we all know is, terribly underserved, and there are so many health equity issues for that population.
I think those are bright spots. I'm also very interested in, how we can actually embed trials within an electronic medical record, which is a really probably among the most efficient ways to do trials, as we learned from COVID. But I think those are great things that are going on. And the day that you all get the randomized trial all set up, let me know. But I mean, I think those are really critical things to do. And I think they are very encouraging. And it's amazing what can be done. But I think perhaps we should also consider that there may be more than one registry and more than one way to do this. But I think those are bright spots in our horizon for sure.
And actually,
I think
we'd be
go ahead,
remiss if, sorry, I think we'd be remiss if we, I'm looking at Michelle Whitcopp's screen image, and it's reminding me that in fact there is another database which I would love to see working together with Athens, which is the Community Voices in Research. I mean, Michelle, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I know you've turned off your camera and you weren't planning
totally
on participating. I am totally so.
Come on, you made us do it.
But my understanding is that the registry is now up to about 1,300 people across the country. They're looking at questions like employment and medical marijuana use and pain. And I'm going to stop talking because Michelle turned her camera on. Michelle, I apologize. But I was actually hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit, not just about the data that you're holding, sort of things that NHF has learned from people and families living with inherited blood disorders, but also how, when I look at CVR, I think of you as a resource for connecting a researcher who wants to collaborate with people and families living with IBD and them learn from those folks. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. And I'm not sure. I think that my internet is slow. So I'm sorry if I'm freezing up here, but thank you, Ziva. Yes, CVR is at about 1,300, 1,400 for people who are enrolled. And this is an opportunity for us to hear directly from patients as to their experiences, their journey of living with an inheritable bleeding disorder, and not only from the person who has it, but also from their unaffected family members. And we have been using this with external researchers. So HTC providers, we have been providing information to our industry partners, PharmD, or not PharmD, but PhD students. I'm trying to think of all of the different type of external researchers that have accessed our database. And it's all reported in a de-identified and aggregate manner. So there's no personal information going out. But it's information that hasn't been looked at before in other ways. And it's wonderful information. The other opportunity we have offered to the community is the opportunity to be on virtual advisory panels. And so one of the things that NHF has often been asked is, can you connect me with somebody that I can talk to about whatever the topic may be? And we've always been hesitant about doing that, but in this manner, we can do it in a very confidential way. And we've been able, for people that have projects, initiatives, or research questions, are designing clinical trials and want patient input into it so that they can provide that to the FDA. This has been another avenue for patients to have their direct voice into that. And we've been really pleased with the response from our participants as well as from the external researchers. So yes, it is another database that's available. Thank you for mentioning it.
And, I think that what I'm going to take a little moderator's prerogative here, but also say that, I think that our goal is not to have everything under one umbrella, but to have all of our groups work together so that we are efficient and we're not recreating the wheel. So, I think Athen has got an amazing platform and has obviously had success in multiple studies, and then tapping into the community voices and I think we all have our area of expertise within each group, HTRS, FWGBD, Athen, NHF, and I think our job here is to work together and to find the ways that we can tap into each of our expertise in a way that ultimately benefits the patient community. And, one of the things that I've said, and I'll offer a bit of a challenge to pharma, is that, we can study pharma drugs, but I would like to study the patient and the patient health. And that to me is the goal. And so perhaps part of that is studying how a drug works in a patient, but that does not answer the ultimate question, which Charles alluded to previously, which is, what does that really mean for that patient's health? So for me, I think our call to arms at the end of this whole thing is, how do we make this efficient so that it best serves the patient community, and that we can find a way to fund it so that we are being good stewards of the funding that is provided to this project by the various entities that we talked about before. So that's not really a question, but you guys are all welcome to comment on it.
If I may, I just wanted to add, to your point of not housing everything under one umbrella, we have collaborated very nicely because our data set is entirely different. And so we collaborated with Athen on looking at a patient definition for poor outcomes. Athen looked at the physician definition, and we got input from patients and from consumers, and we're able to provide that to them. And then one of our researchers is getting data from the CVR, and then also going to be accessing Athen. And so I think that that's a beautiful chemistry to be able to utilize that collaboration and that combination there.
Yeah, that's why I had my hand up, Shannon. I wanted to give a shout out to the recent CVR Athen collaboration. They helped us, as Michelle said, it was our machine learning project, and helping us define what a poor outcome would look like from a patient perspective. So I think that, it was a really big success, and it showed how we could collaborate to further, the resources and the outputs for the community.
That's awesome. And I do have trouble seeing the hands on the white background, so I apologize for that. So any other comments on how we can all work together in that collaboration as different entities within the community? Or Charles, as an outside view looking in, what are some good ways for collaboration and what has worked in other areas that you've practiced in, researched in?
So I will say in my experience, first of all, successful collaborations are incremental, right? I mean, we all come into this wanting to solve the big problems, but it's rare that we can actually do it the first time out. And so, being willing to say, here's what I can get done, and that doesn't satisfy the vision, but it's a step forward, has been, really key. Part of that is, where can we get early return? Again, I'm a relentless pragmatist about this, and the networks that I've seen work have been relentlessly pragmatic. What can we do that's a first step that's actually going to benefit patients or benefit clinicians, ideally both? And then how can we build on that one step at a time? And the third, which I think we've talked about, is what are the ways that we can engage lots of voices, right? That's going to make it harder to take each step, but it's going to mean that each step when we take it is more meaningful, right? And making room in that conversation for each of the voices identifying the steps that are important to them and saying, okay, here's an incremental goal. We can get to that. Here's the next goal. The last thing that I'll say from my perspective, and again, this is the informatician talking, the more that we can figure out when we're taking the first step, what the 10th step is going to look like and set us up to take that 10th step in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of engagement, the better we're going to do, right? That doesn't mean solving all of the problem, but it means asking, am I willing to do 80% more design and 10% more execution now to know that I'll be able to address that 10th step when I get there?
Dr. Young, welcome back. I know you had to go see a patient. So a couple of questions that arose about infrastructure. One was, there were a couple different versions of infrastructure. And I think we decided that, we didn't have to have one for a research study. You could have one for a certain research study and then a different type of structure for a different research study. But is there anything about recommendation? One of the questions was about centralization and decentralization. In other words, we're centralizing for infrastructure, but we should decentralize to get out into the community. How do we, balance out that tension? And what of our infrastructure kind of makes that possible?
Well, I mean, centralization is only useful if it's actually helpful at the local site. Otherwise, it's a waste of time and effort. And what I mean by that is, so for example, things we talked about was that, there's a lot of centers who are just so clinically focused and so heavy with doing the clinical work, which is their primary mission, access to care, of course, that, the research mission just has to take, it's just not the priority, and they don't have the manpower, the staffing. And so we talked about how, and I mentioned this in my talk, how some centers just need a little bit of startup help. Could we envision having a, sort of roving, traveling, I mean, forget COVID for now. I mean, I don't mean forget COVID. I mean, eventually, travel is going to be fine and everybody will be fine to travel again. I mean, it's not going to be for the rest of our lifetimes that we can't travel. So can we have a roving expert CRC? Clinical research coordinator or research nurse or somebody like that, who is, either based out of NHF or based out of Athens, or really just it works as a consultant, who, can go to different centers and help to troubleshoot with getting things, moving along. Sometimes you just need that inertia to get things started. And then once things get started, then they're moving along really well. I mean, my own experience here at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, despite the fact that it's a large HTC, when I got here 14 years ago, there was virtually no research going on. And it took a lot of effort to get the ball rolling. But once the ball was rolling, now it's, I'm not going to say it's easy because it's not, but the systems are in place, the personnel are in place that, we can kind of roll with it and participate in a variety of different types of studies. So for some centers, just, seeing that mountain to climb to say, oh my God, I mean, how are we even going to start? Is really the rate limiting step. And if we can offer funding, centralized support, be it a traveling research coordinator, a virtual research coordinator, somebody that can help get them going and at least get them started on, 1 or 2 or 3 Athens studies that they might be interested in. That may be enough to allow that center to really get things rolling. And then they'll find that they might enjoy the participation. The investigator might get benefits such as co-authorship on some papers, which is, I think, really, really important for investigators. I mean, especially young investigators, that's the carrot to dangle in front of them. So you offer them some support. You tell them, well, if you can, do your part, we'll offer you some support. You can get started, and then we'll figure out a way to get you involved in committees and authorships and things like that. And that really gets people motivated. So there has to be a effort that is, that where the centralized effort, whatever the central parts are, be it documents, be it databases or standard operating procedures, things like that, or be it actually human beings who can either help via this format or help by actually being there in person, which I think can help even more. That may be the way to look at those HTCs that are not doing any research, but may be interested with the younger investigators who are taking over the Hemophilia Treatment Center, and get them moving to the next step where they can, definitely do CDC surveillance and 1 or 2 Athens studies. But, that's going to have to come from support with, not just financial support, just throwing money, saying, oh, here's $50,000, good luck. That doesn't work like that. I mean, the money is part of it, but you have to also offer that sort of the support to get somebody to move to that next level. And that support often has to be, a person, and whether that person is linked with Athens or NHF, I can't think of other organizations that might help, or whether it's just a consultant that can get paid by Athens or NHF to help those centers. I think that's where the central local part works best, where the local people get the support they need from the central to help them. And that's how it has to be. It can't be the sort of the tail wagging the dog, not the central place saying, well, you have to do this, but the local place saying, I want to do this, and then you help me out. So that's how I would talk about the central and local infrastructure. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Maggie.
I don't know how to. Well, Guy, I agree with you a lot. One thing that we might want to do is really think futuristic. In other words, if there were sites of excellence where young folks could be trained, and or HTC staff could be trained and have the resources and have the understanding and are engaged, and then once trained want to do this, it would then flow into these centers and we could build a research network more easily. So it may not be overnight. And I agree with your suggestion, but I see a time when we will have that kind of interest and activity in a research way. I mean, look where we are now. We were not here years ago. I started in my center with one nurse. She was an orthopedic nurse. And I said, darn, I want to do research. And I want to do it because look at all these problems these patients have. They were getting AIDS, they were getting inhibitors, this, that, and this, that. And so the point is, I see a time when we have to have, work towards a time when all centers would have that potential. That will be good for our patients. That will be good for our centers to have the ability to do some of these things. And it will also promote the research effort. I
think there's no doubt about that. I think what I'm saying is, so I've, through various different reasons, I've been to a lot of HTCs around the country. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Hawaii to their HTC. They invited me to spend a couple of days there to, do some talks, but mostly to give them some advice on how they can not just take care of patients, but also participate in research. And so you've got a center there that is very clinically focused, has a really excellent HTC director. But, I think that to get a center like that to really be able to participate in they're participating in some things, but to participate in more, it's going to take more than just, like I said, it's throwing money at a problem is not the only solution. It's money with the support together that has to do that. And, I don't know that we'll get all the 135, 6, whatever it is, HTCs to get to that level on the pyramid where I would like to see them. But I mean, I can tell you, from my understanding, I don't even know that we're even half that are doing that. So I think that there's plenty of room for us to find those HTCs, identify those ones that we think can do more, that have an interested person to do more, and then figure out the right way through this SOS and whatever recommendations come out of it to provide support and funding to bring them to that next level. And I think that's really, from my standpoint and from the work that me and my committee have done the last few months, that would be what I'd like to see. If we're at 60 or 70 HTCs that are fairly well engaged I'm just talking about the second level, which was registries and Athens studies. If we can get to 100 in the next couple of years, I think that would be great. That's 30 more probably than we have now. I'm not saying 70 is the exact number. We'd have to really dig into that a little bit, but for sure it's not 135. So there's work to do.
Thank you. We are up on time now, so we're going on to the summary. That was great. This has been a great discussion, and I hate to have to be the one to curtail it, but I would sit around and talk with you guys about this for a while, and I hope to be able to do it in person before too long. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the meeting. Bye.
Thank you.